Someone called 911 for Alecia Lindsay. The dispatcher answered. The dispatcher acknowledged the call. The dispatcher said officers would be sent. No unit was dispatched for more than 72 minutes. It was February 8, 2024. The temperature in Anchorage, Alaska ranged between 17 and 28 degrees Fahrenheit. There were 35 inches of snow on the ground. Alecia Lindsay was outside. She was 31 years old. She died of hypothermia that night. When officers finally arrived, 72 minutes after the first call, she was already gone. The dispatcher had the information. The caller had given it clearly. A woman was outside in the cold in Anchorage in February. The system heard it. The system logged it. The system did not send anyone in time. Alecia Lindsay was 31 and lived in Anchorage, a city where survival outdoors without shelter is measured in minutes, not hours. At 17 degrees, the body loses core heat faster than it can replace it. Confusion precedes numbness. Shivering gives way to slowing. Consciousness can fail before rescue arrives. A neighbor saw her and did what the system asks citizens to do in emergencies. They called 911 and described what they saw. A woman outside, in distress, exposed to lethal temperatures. That caller trusted the public safety system to act. That trust rested on protocols designed to treat cold exposure as time-sensitive. Those protocols were not followed. The first 911 call came from a resident who encountered Alecia near a garage. The caller described a woman outside, appearing in distress. The dispatcher asked triage questions and recorded answers. Emergency dispatch triage exists to classify calls by urgency. It is calibrated to identify time-critical threats. A person reported outside in sub-freezing temperatures in Anchorage is not an ambiguous case. Cold exposure in those conditions progresses rapidly toward death. The call should have triggered immediate dispatch and an elevated priority classification. Instead, the call was logged, assigned a lower priority, and no unit was immediately sent. The caller had done their part. The system had the information. Nothing moved. 72 minutes requires context. In Anchorage, in February, at 17 to 28 degrees Fahrenheit, an exposed person without shelter does not have 72 minutes. Medical literature is precise. At those temperatures, significant hypothermia can develop within 30 to 60 minutes depending on clothing, moisture, wind, and body mass. The transition from treatable hypothermia to irreversible organ failure is not gradual, it crosses a threshold. Once core temperature drops beyond that threshold, rewarming may not reverse the damage. By the time officers arrived 72 minutes after the first call, Alecia had passed that threshold. The window that existed when the first call was made, the window where intervention could have saved her, had closed while the call sat in the dispatch system. A second call followed. The situation had not changed. Alecia remained outside and in the cold. The caller reported again. The dispatcher received the information again. The documentation of that night survives. Call logs record timestamps, the wording of reports, and the actions taken. Plaintiffs in the lawsuit filed against the city of Anchorage in March 2026 point to those logs. They argue that the timeline is not a matter of a reasonable split-second judgment under uncertainty, but a documented failure to follow mandatory protocol. A dispatcher assessing a call about a person outside in 17-degree weather is not making a creative decision. The protocol exists. The protocol has steps. The steps were not followed. Emergency dispatch protocol in the United States is explicit. Dispatch centers use trained, written, and tested procedures to classify calls and assign response levels. Certification programs require dispatchers to assess reports against defined criteria and escalate appropriately. Cold exposure calls involving a person unable to reach warmth trigger specific steps, escalation questions, immediate reclassification if the person is shivering or immobile, and dispatch within minutes rather than an hour. These are operational requirements, not optional judgments. The lawsuit on behalf of Alecia's estate contends that the dispatcher's actions amounted to a failure to follow mandatory procedure, conduct that courts increasingly find is not shielded by absolute immunity. For decades, a broad legal immunity sheltered 911 dispatchers from personal liability, grounded in the idea that they act under pressure with incomplete information. Courts applied that doctrine widely, limiting civil accountability for dispatch errors. Recent rulings, however, have narrowed that shield. In 2026, the New Mexico Supreme Court drew a distinction. When a dispatcher fails to follow established mandatory protocol, immunity does not apply. The Anchorage suit proceeds under similar reasoning. The call logs and written protocols create a record where the gap between required action and actual response is documentable and legally consequential. Alecia Lindsay's case is not isolated. Documentation of dispatch failures across the country reveals a pattern. Calls come in, urgency is apparent to callers, and responses fail to arrive within critical windows. Failures occur in cold exposure cases, medical emergencies, and domestic violence incidents. They occur in small and large jurisdictions, when dispatchers are undertrained, overloaded, or functioning within cultures that do not enforce protocol compliance. Alecia's case adds a stark documented example. A clear call, 2 acknowledgments, 72 minutes, and a coroner's finding of death by hypothermia. The legal framework around dispatcher accountability is evolving. Long-standing doctrines that equated dispatch decisions with discretionary judgments are giving way to more nuanced standards that separate judgment from mandatory procedure. The Anchorage lawsuit, filed in March 2026, argues that the dispatcher's failure was procedural, not a protected discretionary act in a life-threatening situation. The outcome could reshape how similar cases are judged in Alaska and beyond. A person in crisis in Anchorage in February has seconds, not hours. The reliability of the system depends on training, enforcement, and accountability for the individual who answers the line. Someone called 911 for Alecia Lindsay. The line was answered, help was promised. 72 minutes passed, the temperature was 17 degrees Fahrenheit. The hypothermia did not pause while the dispatch log remained unassigned. By the time officers arrived, Alecia was dead. She was 31. She had not called for herself. Someone else had done the right thing. The system received the report. The system logged it. The system failed to act in time. Subscribe to Case Files TV